All right, so we're going to start with Jim Simpson. He is our first speaker. Let me pull up his book. Okay. Jim is also a valued member of my Anti-Communism Action Team Speakers Bureau. He's an investigative journalist and author of The Red-Green Axis. His latest book is Who Was Karl Marx? The Men, the Motives, and the Menace Behind Today's Rampaging American Left, which is a bestseller on Amazon. Jim is a former economist for the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB. He was featured in the documentaries The Enemies Within and Agenda, Grinding America Down. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Daily Caller, Epoch Times, and Washington Times. Jim will introduce us tonight to the little-known but consequential Marxist theorists who brought us to this point. You may never heard of the people that Jim's going to describe, but they explain a lot of what we're seeing today. Jim, take it away.
Start it. Okay. Do you guys see all that? Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So, and I'm going to time this so I don't go over times, otherwise I'll talk too much. My Indian name is Long Wind. So a lot of you guys are probably familiar with some of these people. This is the cover of my book. And I'm not going to go through everybody today, but I am going to go through some consequential radicals that most people have never heard of. Now, this group may be accepted either because you've seen my presentations before or because you've done your own research. But most people, for example, have never heard of Sergei Nechayev, but he is the most important radical, maybe in the history of communism, because he took Marxism and then he boiled it down into a 3-page pamphlet of strategies called the Revolutionary Catechism. Now, most people haven't heard him, but he was very famous in his time. He co-opted the slogan, "The ends justified the means." He was a member of the Russian nihilist movement, which were essentially anarchists. He was the subject of Dostoevsky's book, Demons. And his group assassinated Tsar Alexander II while he was in prison. Lenin called him the Titan of the Revolution. And the Catechism, that 3-page document, is a model for all subsequent communist revolutions. Eldridge Cleaver, like most leftists, were familiar with this guy. They called the Catechism his Bible. And you can see what he says here. All they care about is the happiness of society. But in order to achieve that happiness, they first have to destroy everything. So to that end, they're going to use all their resources and energy towards increasing and intensifying the evils and miseries of the people until at last their patience is exhausted and they're driven to a general uprising. Isn't that exactly where we are today? This is Nechayev's strategy applied today. And Gramsci, who we will talk about, many of you I'm sure know, Gramsci wrote the Prison Notebooks, and he talked about a war of position in culture, and another radical called it the Long March Through the Institutions. Well, where did he get his idea? He got his idea from Nechayev. And Nechayev said in this one paragraph, he live within society while pretending to be completely different from what he is, for he has to penetrate everywhere, all the higher and middle classes, houses of commerce, churches, the palace of the aristocracy, the worlds of the bureaucracy, literacy, literature, and the military. And that's exactly what they do. And that is what Gramsci took 3,000 pages to explain in his Prison Notebooks, which Nechayev succinctly explains here in one paragraph. Lenin's Red Terror was inspired by Nechayev. The Cloward-Piven strategy of manufactured crisis, cultural Marxism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff came out of, was inspired by Nechaev's catechism. Now, I just wanted to stay right here. You know, the hate America tactic is not something that we developed over the last 10 or 20 years. The hate America tactic was first articulated by Lenin, who said we must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn towards those who disagree with us. And then in the 40s, they sent out memos to the communist parties of the world, telling them to continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our opponents, label them fascist or Nazi or anti-Semite. This was happening back in the 40s. It's not new. Here's another person you may not have heard of. He was sort of that era's George Soros, but he was much smarter than George Soros. He controlled a vast media empire. He created the Popular Front concept, the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. He influenced a lot of Hollywood actors and other influential people. For all his trouble, he was killed by Stalin. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him. We must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink, because only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose communism. And that's what they have accomplished. They have corrupted our society to the point where it stinks. And look at these tactics that he lists here. Must avoid being a purely communist organization, bring in other names, other groups to make persecution more difficult. And look what he says there. You could take this out of the playbook from any modern leftist here. You do not call yourself a communist, you're independent. You are shocked and frightened by what's going on here, right here in our country. You think the capitalist system is corrupt, and you say it over and over and over again, and you say nothing else. And we see people parroting those exact lines in Black Lives Matter, Antifa, all these different groups. Came right from Munzenberg. And Georgy Lukács, Minister of Culture in the Hungarian Soviet Republic, he came up with the concept of using sex as a weapon to destroy our culture. And he was very successful. He called it cultural terrorism. And they imposed that in conservative Catholic Hungary during the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which only lasted a few months before they got thrown out. But it was explicit sex education to children, female sexual liberation, and he impressed a wealthy Marxist in German Marxist Study Week, which founded the School for Social Research, which inspired this wealthy industrialist to underwrite the cost of the School for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany, which came to be known as the Frankfurt School. And then here's Antonio Gramsci, who I said took 3,000 pages to say what Nechaev said in one paragraph. And he talks about a war of position to challenge the dominant cultural hegemony. And his notebooks are all written in Italian. Were not available in the United States in English until Joseph Buttigieg, a professor at Notre Dame and prominent Marxist who founded the Gramscian Society, International Gramscian Society. He spent 10 years translating the prison notebook. So now we have them, thanks to Pete Buttigieg's father. And so I talked about the Frankfurt School. They had to flee Germany in the 30s to escape Hitler. And they relocated to Columbia Teachers College, where graduates made up more than 60% of all teacher and educational administrative posts in the country. That's scary. And they created critical theory. Now, critical theory was not something they created out of thin air. Karl Marx said, the proclamation of ready-made solutions for all times is not our affair. What? I thought that was the whole purpose. Nope. He said, I'm speaking of a ruthless criticism of everything existing. And they weren't going to curb their speech no matter what the result was. And that's where critical theory came from, invented by the Frankfurt School, relocated to Columbia Teachers College in 1937. They published this brand new theory called critical theory, and I list the goals of the critical theory here. And then, of course, critical race theory is just downstream from critical theory. It's all Marxism. It's all communism. All came directly from Marx. And the goal of these people, their strategy is psychological terrorism, constant vilification, constant discrediting, and we participate in it. You know, the sexual revolution of the 60s helped really usher in a period where, family breakups, pornography, and all of these things that have helped to corrupt our culture and destroy Christianity, which was the real goal, because the communists knew that religion, our Judeo-Christian culture, is not a weakness. It's our source of strength and stability. And so that was the #1 target. And then a prominent Frankfurt School Marxist who you may have heard of is Herbert Marcuse. He's been called the father of the New Left, the father of the sexual revolution. He is credited with the slogan, "Make love, not war," although he doesn't admit it, says that's not true. But he came up with the idea of repressive, well, he wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance, where he argued that our country was repressive. And even though we had a First Amendment, that First Amendment didn't really let them do anything. So the answer was to create something that came to be known as partisan tolerance, tolerance of ideas from the left only, and intolerance even towards thought, opinion, and word from anybody else. And he lists the various people who are fascists, you know, and these are the people who, like us, maybe don't believe in radically expanded welfare and things like that. But he came with this idea of partisan tolerance, which means that anybody who's not a leftist gets their speech silenced. And that's where the idea for the cancel culture came from. Marcuse, here's some few more things that he says, but we don't have time to go through that. He worked with Julian Bond, who was the co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's where the Southern Poverty Law Center got its hate agenda. It comes right out of Marcuse's partisan tolerance. It's communist tactic, and the Southern Poverty Law Center is communist to its core. They need to be defunded, faced with prosecution as a continuing criminal enterprise, and have all their resources confiscated. And then finally, we have the creator of white privilege, Noel Ignatieff, who was another SDS radical. He was a member of the most radical wing of the Communist Party USA, the Provisional Organizing Committee, hardcore Stalinist. And there's what he says. We need to make sure the construct known as the white race is utterly destroyed. That's where white privilege. So all of this stuff is communism, folks. It's all communism. And that's what it is, and that's all it is. And my time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Let's see. All right, let me introduce Jeff. Jeff is a Potomac Tea Party executive committee member, and he's an avid blogger. He's got quite a wicked sense of humor. Jeff is going to give us a lighthearted look at the present day mind of the leftist. Take it away, Jeff.
All right, can everybody see me?
Yep.
All right, let's kick this off. Come on. All right. Has this ever happened to you? Do you find yourself in a talking with a leftist, presenting facts or well thought out arguments, only to get a respond with some dopey straw man or regurgitation of what idiocy was on Jimmy Kimmel or Trevor Noah the night before? Well, I had that same problem until I went out and read my 5-part series, The Mind of the Leftist. Normally I'd give a little bit of background and some intro, but time is short and got a long way to go and a short time to get there. So gonna do what we said can't be done. So the first part is, how can the left call conservatives anti-science when they are so violently anti-math? Can't say you're pro-science if you're against math. Now, before we jump into this, we've got to talk about the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and that's creationism. And that's one valid point that leftists get in arguing with some of the folks on our side. Now, let's face it, there's just too much evidence to show the world's definitely a few million years old. It's indisputable. But when, about, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, when under W, we started getting these arguments about intelligent design. I was having beers with some buddies of mine that said, hey, so you Republicans don't believe in evolution anymore, huh? I just responded to them. I said, look, guys, you're wasting your time with me on this one. The last time I took a biology class, it was in freshman year of high school, taught by a Catholic nun, somewhere between the ages of 60 and 100, which, as everyone knows, that's the approximate age of every nun that teaches in Catholic schools. And when the subject of evolution came up, she said, okay, the Bible states that God created the world in 7 days. The Bible does not say how long those days were. And she then proceeded to teach evolution in a manner that even the most hardcore atheist would have approved of. So I pointed that out to my friends, and that was the last time they ever brought the subject up with me again. I guess I took the fun out of it for them. But anyway, now with that out of the way, let's get to the heart of this post. One ironclad guaranteed way to annoy a leftist is to ask them to quantify any kind of argument they're making. Favorite one to pester them with is the cult of climastrology, global warming, whatever it is they're calling it next month. I'm sorry, I'm not being very patient with them. I don't like people who just casually label me a climate denier when they can't even detail what it is I'm supposedly denying. Help me out here. Is it really radical or extreme that before declaring a crisis that you at least established what the norm or steady state is, how much change is acceptable, how it's being measured? A few years ago, I wrote a post showing how we could actually balance the budget. No tricks, no gimmicks, no BS. Used a few relatively simple spreadsheets, bridge the budget gap, system where everybody pays regardless of income level. The tax rate is savagely progressive enough that even a hardcore Sandinista would have loved it. Short answer, it wouldn't have worked. It would ruin our economy, but it puts things in perspective. And one of my lefty pals on Facebook took exception with my assertions. I asked for, okay, where's your plan? How do we balance it? I mean, I'm not looking for nitty-gritty detail, just broad strokes, something where we could at least find a common ground and talk. And he just retorted that he didn't need math. I wish I could make that up. I really didn't. So another case, we were talking about numbers about the failures of Obamacare just a few years in, how America still had over 32 million without insurance. Another one of my lefty pals tried snarking at me, said, hey, we got 14 million people health insurance, which I would point out was mostly from expanding Medicaid. How could that be a failure? Well, I responded by asking him, why is 46 million uninsured a crisis that demanded hasty, poorly thought out legislation, but 32 million success? For that matter, what made 46 the crisis number? Had we started out with 60 million and reduced the number 46, would you be calling that a success? Or if we started with 32 million, would we have called that a crisis and deemed 18 million success? And while we're at it, on any scale I've ever looked at, when your goal is 46 and you score a 12, that's pretty much failure in any book. So what makes your case different? As you might have guessed, he kind of went silent after that. So let's see here. So we've got to jump ahead a bit because some other examples we could see there was like Obama's czars, these unaccountable bureaucrats with a lot of power and budgets but no measurement. We saw how poorly scored the Obamacare was. UN had these 40 sustainability goals where had they actually achieved all of them, 5 or 6 of them were at cross purposes with each other, would not have worked out. So we're going to jump ahead to the second part now. Now, the left has 2 advantages, and I have no idea how we overcome them. So back when Sister Babe was pregnant with little Bob, my wife and son, we had a conversation about how our lives would be changing once we became parents. And one concern my wife raised was that I'd no longer be able to spend my Sundays in the fall going to the Rhino Bar in Georgetown, drinking too much beer and with the other crazies watching Philadelphia Eagles football. Well, the Rhino Bar has since closed, and I kind of swore off the NFL a few years ago, but that's a different story. And she was afraid that I would come to resent her and our child for taking that ability from my life. Now, that was the pregnancy talk, and my wife's got a good head on her shoulders. She wouldn't have become a wife and soon-to-be mother with someone who didn't share her views. What I said to her is, I said, look, I have to give up things in my life now because of a long series of choices I made that got me here. I'm not going to get angry at other people over the consequences of my decisions. I'm a conservative. And we both got a bit of a chuckle out of that, but underneath, I really was serious about it. We've seen a lot of ways that the left failed, like under the Obama administration. Oh, you'll hear me talk a lot more about Barry O than about President Asterisk. This was written in 2016. So as we know, there have been plenty of failures in the last few years. I'm not ignoring them. So we had, under Obama, we had this stuff in Syria, the rise of ISIS, Ebola being failed to take into account, all these long waits at Veterans Affairs, all the launch of Obamacare, and all these states' exchanges couldn't even have a working website going. Where's any accountability in all this? Now, do you notice something that's missing from all of these failures? There isn't any quantifiable objective. With accountability comes responsibility, which is the heart of the issue. Leftists cringe at the notion of personal responsibility the same way that vampires cringe at the sight of a crucifix, or for that matter, the same way leftists cringe at the sight of a crucifix. The 2 words you will never, under any circumstances, hear from a leftist are the words, I'm responsible. Unless it's taking credit for somebody else's work, of course. But why? Leftists don't actually care about the results of any policy, politician, ballot measure they support. One metric only that is universally applied by every leftist that predetermines whether or not anything they support is a good idea or not. And it's the question, does supporting this idea make me feel good about myself? If the answer is yes, then facts or reality be damned. It's a good idea, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to convince them otherwise. Heck, they seem to wear their thought process of being impervious to reason or logic like a badge of honor. I'm sure everybody hearing this has seen these mental contortions that leftists will go through to justify their beliefs. Yeah, you had the broken promises of if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. If you like a doctor, you can keep your doctor. Your rates will not go up. In no way were they an indication that Obama was either lying or lacked even the most basic grasp of reality. It was actually the fault of, those evil businesses, big businesses, not bending reality to match Obama's claims. The rise of ISIS, Bush's fault for invading Iraq, anger in politics, fault of those haters, lots of examples I could cite. But because leftists are incapable of accepting responsibility, they are also incapable of feeling any guilt over anybody who gets hurt over any of the results of any of their policies. Now, this is a 5-part series, but for time constraints, I'm going to jump straight to part 5, which is that religious extremists are our biggest threat, and they're not who you think. Now, when I talk to leftists, one of the things I noticed over the years, and it's just, anecdotes aren't research. But that said, I've argued with them, leftists of varying intelligence, very bright but misguided to complete idiots. But the one thing I noticed consistently applied across the board, how almost every leftist reacts when faced with facts that contradict their beliefs. Either 1, they ignore the facts, 2, change the subject, often incorporating some straw man argument, 3, name calling, personal attacks, or 4, some combination of 1 through 3. My moment of clarity actually came in a Facebook debate over an article written in the Federalist in early 2016 about how President Obama's manner of governing helped contribute to the rise of Trump. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a Jersey boy. I've never been a fan of Donald Trump as a person. Obviously, I came around a bit to his presidency. But at any rate, these people knew I'd never had any love for him. But at least after reading this article, I could understand the reasons why so many people would support him, because at the time I wasn't seeing it. And a few of my lefty pals took exception to this article and attributed the rise of Trump to, you guessed it, racism. And I'm wondering how they could have gleaned that from the article. I asked him, what specific points in this article do you disagree with? And the response was, racism. And for all the years of beer-infused debates, sparring in comment sections, lengthy Facebook food fights, that was the moment where the clouds parted and I finally gained insight in leftist mind. They do not understand our arguments because they are incapable of understanding our arguments. Basically, they see themselves, for them, this is their religion. They see themselves as saints, redeemers, and the rest of us as infidels. And that's part of what makes them so dangerous. They regard those who oppose them as the eternally damned. They're on a mission to create a kingdom of heaven on earth by redistributing income, using the state to enforce politically correct attitudes and practices on everyone's life. They want to control what you do, who you are, what you drive, what you eat, all for your own good, of course. Now, the fact that they're saving the world, or saving the planet, I guess would be a better term they use, that justifies everything they do. And that's part of why you just see such a nastiness with them when you disagree with them, why they take such pleasure in the politics of personal destruction, why they go straight for the jugular and just show no respect. Basically, they see themselves as an army of saints, the rest of us is Satan, and that's why it justifies anything they do. Robert Stacy McCain had a great quote, what inspires the left's rage, the source of their constant accusations that ordinary Americans are racist, sexist, homophobes, is simply that the left expects the rest of us to accept their authority as our moral superiors, and they get really angry when we don't do it. So the last thing I want to leave with is just that, in addition to that, the left's inability to understand our conservative arguments. It's not from the fact they lack the mental capacity, although in some cases it's certainly true, but because they do not have the spiritual capability to accept facts and reality that contradict beliefs that they so dearly need to be true. And there's a lot more here, but I'm going to be kind and not go over and not be that guy who does that. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, we're going to go on now to our third speaker, Paula Weiss. It's actually Paula's birthday, so happy birthday, Paula.
Thank you, Chris.
Paula is the author of the Antifan Girlfriend. It's a dystopian novel which extrapolates from present trends and shows us what will happen if the left takes over. She gives us a very clear picture of what it would be like to live under social credit scoring and what happens to people when they disobey the regime or if they just happen to be born class enemies. So with that introduction, Paula, take it away.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. Just so you get an idea of what it looks like, this is the novel, The Antifan Girlfriend, and I seem to have trouble with mirrors here. It's also available in ebooks and as an audiobook now. And you don't have to get it on Amazon, but that's the easiest way to do it. Anyway, over 2 years ago, in January of 2020, I started writing this novel. And I started not with a manifesto in mind, but with this image of a woman, a librarian, sitting in a dark library by herself under a skylight, guarding the remaining paper books that existed in this country, which is the Diversity Justice Republic. It's set in 2089, 30 years after a civil war has sundered the United States. After the Civil War, you have the blue Diversity Justice Republic, which hugs the coast of the former United States. You have the interior, mostly landlocked, still red United States. And then, of course, you have the newly independent Texas Republic, which was a sop to my relatives down there, but it makes sense. And a few states like Minnesota and Wisconsin that joined Canada. Malia is the sole remaining librarian in the False Knowledge Depository in Anacostia, and she accidentally lets in or carelessly lets in an illegal reader. This leads to an Antifan Defense Forces squad raiding the library and dragging off the hapless professor. Malia thinks that she is going to be in a lot of trouble, but what happens is the leader of the squad, David, turns out to be sympathetic. He falls in love with her. He tells her eventually, when he finds out about the child who was seized from her because she committed cultural appropriation of some kind, he says, I'm going to find your daughter. I'm going to bring her back to you. And then we're going to escape into the United States. The search for the child brings Molly into a different environment where she becomes an operative against several economic tower bureaucrats who are actually engaging in experiments on low social credit tiers. And that's getting a little ahead of us. But that's basically the plot. Now, the generating feature of this society in the Diversity Justice Republic is social credit. And I'm going to go through some of the underlying principles here. And I will tell you something. When I started writing this in winter and spring of 2020, I thought I was writing science fiction. I did not envision that by the end of 2020, social credit would become more of a reality, at least in the minds of a lot of people who follow trends. I didn't think some of these things like a Coronavirus Liberation Day parade in which the populace of the DJR celebrates the taming of the American penchant for individualism through the strictures of coronavirus control. I thought I was writing science fiction. And the one question I do get from people is, why did you set this so far in the future? Why 2089? It's happening now. Okay, so social credit is the underlying principle that organizes the DJR. And your social credit score is a combination of your identity. Are you Black or Asian, a woman? Are you transgender? Are you gay? Plus your job. Obviously, if you're a regime functionary, depending on how high you are, your score will be higher. And also some volunteer work on the side that Molly is constantly using to try to get her score up. Molly is a low social credit tier. David, as an Antifan Forces commander, is a high social credit tier. And she suddenly, when she dates him, enters this Cinderella type existence where she's getting a lot more access to goods and privileges that normally are off limits to her. Now, what she doesn't know initially is that David is actually a deplorable. And that's the third group in this novel. You have high social credit tiers, self-explanatory, low social credit tiers, and then you have the deplorables who landed on the wrong side of the border after the war. David was basically taken from his Flora family and forced to become an Antifan. And he likes his job, but he doesn't think about it too much because I think that would probably drive him crazy. So we have these divisions. The social creditors all despise the deplorables who they rely on for menial labor. Now, your access to goods, scarce goods under socialism, obviously depends on your social credit. What's the excuse? Because the regime can't say to everyone, well, you have low social credit, so you don't deserve to have any cheese in your healthy eating grocery bag. No, environmentalism becomes the religion. It becomes a way to deprive politically unreliable people of privileges and to keep low social credit tiers angling to get more. So everyone has to pay for new clothes, for example, using carbon offsets because you don't want to hurt the environment, do you? Elites get to ride in self-driving cars or even own their own vehicles. Just like our elites today fly to Davos when they plot to use climate change to keep us from flying in airplanes, right? And then finally, there's the Mother Earth diversity religion. That's an environmental superstructure concept. And that is what gives the high social credit tiers the justification for environmentalism and for controlling most of the population. Christianity, by the way, or proselytizing Christianity, is a capital crime, as is gun ownership, in case you were wondering. So there are several ways in which the regime uses social credit to deprive low social credit tiers and to some extent poorers of privileges. And they fall into several categories. There's the consumer category, there's the movement category, and there's ideas. So for example, in the consumer category, if you're a high social credit tier, you can go into restaurants in nice areas. On Molly and David's first date, they go to the Esplanade, which is on the Harriet Tubman Parkway, where Bethesda is now. And David thinks that because he's a high social crediteer, Malia can be his guest. No, the guards come over and they say, "Are you aware, sir, that you are patronizing this area with a person who is not entitled to be here?" So it's this humiliating experience that really opens David's eyes to Malia's subjugation. A low social crediteer goes to like fast food restaurants and maybe food trucks, and they eat mostly vegetarian food. Their healthy eating bag doesn't contain the nice things that a high social crediteur's bag might contain. And the poor's have even less. Then in movement, high social crediteers, like I said, might own their own car. If they're really high, like David, they have access to self-driving cars. They can travel by air. Low social crediteers don't get to go to the same nice places on vacation. Beach vacations are mostly out for them. And then plurals aren't allowed to own cars at all, except if they live in rural areas. And like the low social crediteers, they're on diversity buses, which are similar to the buses you would not want to get on in Philadelphia or New York. And so it's not only movement, but also ideas. The great virtual network is where all the permitted viewing and reading is now placed. High social crediteers might be able to own a few paper books, might. Plurals can own paper books if they were published 100 years ago and don't directly confront the regime. Plurals get to go to church as long as they keep it to themselves. But basically, the great virtual network is the consolidation of our social media and publishing elites with the government. And you see that happening now. I don't have to tell any of you this. I can see it gelling right now. And then finally, in the end, the high social crediteers own the bodies of the plurals and the low social crediteers. They can compel labor from the plurals, menial labor, because as one character says in my sequel, they wouldn't know a wrench if it hit them. But also they kidnap low social crediteers, make them go to the economic zones, which are concentration camps that produce most of the country's goods. And at the end of your life, when you are weak, they send you to the euthanasia palace. But if you're a high social crediteer, don't worry, you get to choose when you die. And even in the abortion palace, where Malia finds herself, dragged there by the villain, who I haven't mentioned yet, you know, it's high social credit elites who don't want to have a baby in their lives who force low social credit women there. So throughout this whole book, you will see the effects of social credit in terms of oppression and demonization. So we're seeing much of this today. As I mentioned, the great virtual network is not completely unfamiliar to us. And also the diversity warehouse from which everyone purchases their goods. I don't have to tell you what the parallel is there, but if you order from the diversity warehouse and you're David and living in an elite tower, you can get your stuff a lot sooner than poor Malia can in her much more humble tower in Anacostia, the new name for Washington, D.C. I want to say one other thing that maybe comes out even more so in the sequel, and that's the demonization of those who disagree. And while Jim was talking, I really thought these Marxists would have definitely recognized the diversity, justice, republic. The hatred for the plurals is almost palpable. And as far as the low social crediteers are concerned, there's a category that's even lower than the plurals, and that's the street people who basically get to terrorize low social crediteers at will. And that's not so different from what's going on in our cities, where the high social crediteers pretend to respect the street people, but they don't really have to live among them or suffer the consequences of their behavior. So another question people ask me is, well, why did you write this as fiction? Why didn't you just write a book about social credit and the great virtual network gelling as a result of our social media elites conniving with the government? I have a very practical reason for not having done that, but I don't want to get into that. I actually think we need to be writing and reading more pro-liberty fiction. We can't just rely on 1984 and Animal Farm to carry our water. And the reason for that is there are very few people in the middle of the road, or let alone liberals, who will pick up a book by Tucker Carlson or some other polemic that is written by a known person on the right. You've already cut out those people from hearing what you have to say. Fiction is more accessible to people even if they don't have the same political views as you, you can convey a lot of the truth and the injustice of what you're conveying if you're not lecturing people. If it's coming through in a narrative about characters they care about. So for example, that scene on the Esplanade where Amalia is confronted by the guards to say, you don't belong here. I think in some ways that's a more effective way to present the evil of social credit than just me writing a paragraph saying social credit is very bad and it will divide people according to whether or not the regime approves of them. So I do think we need to encourage more fiction that represents the values that we hold if we really want to make inroads. Because as you know, the publishing world is full of left-wing fiction, and it's very subtle and very clever, or not so subtle, in how it preaches and proselytizes. We don't compete in that area. And I'm not saying anyone has to buy the Antifan Girlfriend, but I'm just saying if you know someone who's fair-minded, who will read fiction, and who might see these points that you're trying to make, if they read it in a novel, by all means, give it a try. I've had several friends of mine from graduate school who are in fact socialists. I'm sure they're socialists. And they contacted me out of the blue after many years and said, you know, I read your book and I don't necessarily agree with your politics, but it made me think. And so if I did nothing else, at least a few socialists may have become a bit more sympathetic to our point of view. And I think I will leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Paula. Let's see. I want to tell people that I really enjoyed reading your book. It's got great characterization, sparkling dialogue. It's really a terrific book. Where can people get your book, Paula?
The easiest way would be to get it through the diversity. Oops, I meant Amazon. It's available there and on Audible as well. But you can also get the ebook through virtually any dealers such as Kobo or Avi Books, or your bookseller would be able to order it, and they wouldn't order it from Amazon. And if all else fails, please feel free to contact me directly, and I will sell you a copy at the price I paid Amazon for the author's copies.
I wrote a series of three-part series with a former leftist who's in our Tea Party. He used to work for an environmental group, went to George Mason, got a master's degree in political science, discovered the American founders, wrote his master's thesis on the American founding, and he's come over to our side, and hence he's in our Tea Party. He and I were talking one day, and he was telling me about the mind of the leftists and what really makes them tick. And it's the ancient Gnostic fantasy that you can make a perfect world here on Earth and that you can end all human suffering. So his approach was, Jeff, you touched on this, that you're not going to get through to them with facts and figures about arguments and things like that. But this guy's approach was, all right, you lefties, you've got a dream, but you know what? It's a stupid dream. There ain't ever going to be a perfect world. There ain't ever going to be heaven on earth, ain't ever going to be the end of all human suffering. Well, first, let me mention that things are far enough along on this social credit subject in the United States that there's actually a bill in New Hampshire and a couple of other states outlawing the use of social credit scoring or social justice scoring or any kind of that kind of scoring in transactions between businesses and transactions between businesses and individuals. So there are some lawmakers, state lawmakers already worried enough about it in the country to start filing bills against it. When will your sequel be out?
Well, the sequel is called The Deplorable Underground, and it's about when Molly is kidnapped, taken back into the DJR. David goes in to get her and starts leading groups of plurals who have gotten very upset with the DJR. And so you're starting to see the glimmers of rebellion. I have finished the draft. I have my beta readers reading it now. I'm hoping to publish at the end of this summer. And that is the advantage of self-publishing. You don't have to wait 2 or 3 years for the traditional publisher to bring out your book.
Yeah.
Okay, Jeff's posted his blog information in the chat. He's at floppingaces.net as Brother Bob. Okay, last question goes to Paula. Paula, you mentioned that there was going to be some kind of homogenized world religion in the diversity, justice, republic in the future. I've seen that idea from time to time. I'm wondering if you see any trends, present day trends, that lead you to suspect that either this is a deliberate thing that is going to be cooked up and concocted and pushed ahead, or if you see any other trends in today's events that lead you to believe that this is a plausible outcome for the future, a one world religion.
Yes, well, I don't know about one world religion, but the Mother Earth diversity religion is specific to the DJR. What Jim said about the demonization of Christianity, though, really rings true, because the DJR clearly sees Christianity and traditional Judaism as enemies to their propaganda and to their worldview. And that's what makes me think that something like the Mother Earth diversity religion, which is a very generic and homogenized, earth-centered or environmentally centered superstructure, can take root. People do look for some kind of supernatural meaning in their lives, even atheists. Their God is atheism, right? And so the DGR knows it has to have some kind of belief system with which it can justify its tyranny, and that's what it is.
You
Go ahead,
know,
Jim. Last comment. You get the last word, Jim.
well, I go into that in some detail in the book too, and I think Pope Francis, has been making noise about Islam and Catholicism. He's made noises about one world religion. He's actually made noises about that. I'd have to go and find the source where I saw that, but I know he has. And, and that's nothing new. Syncretism and ecumenism have been movements in the United States since the turn of the last century. And that's all about stripping, Christianity of any uniqueness. It's all about piling all these religious beliefs into one. They've been doing that for 100 years. And I wrote an article about that for Center for Security Policy called Michigan Faith Communities in the Crosshairs.
And that is the final word. I want to thank our speakers for tonight, Paula, Jim, and Jeff, for fine presentations. That is the end of the formal agenda. We go now into an informal session. I'll unmute everybody. The floor will be open. Anybody can say anything they want. Hope our speakers can stay on for a bit. And thanks. I want to thank everybody for being here and attending our webinar. So let me unmute everybody and we'll go into informal session.
Trevor Loudon's book points out the enemies within. And if we try to, I know it's going to be dangerous to point the finger at certain people who we know hold the cards of being communist, USA Communist Party. I just suggest we start trying to point the finger and prove who we have in our government.
Well, the problem with that is that most of them are not members of the Communist Party. I mean, there are definitely some who are secret members of the Communist Party, but they're not official members of the, many are just, they are fellow travelers. I mean, they believe all of the same things and they're willing to push for all of the same things, but it's not like they go to the communist cell meeting every week and get their instruction like in the old days, It's much more amorphous than that, but they're all on the same page and they're all willing to do the same evil stuff.
I think it's
Well, and I think that because the way it's presented is as though it's the moral thing to do. So much of what's presented is that the left or the communists or the Democrats, whatever you want to call them, are the ones who care and who are trying to save the world and the planet. And I think what needs to be put out there all the time, believe you me, I get a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
So what has to be put out there is that, yes, I care, but you come up with the argument for the way that if we go down this particular path, whether it be carbon credits or not driving or whatever the choice is, vegetarianism, that there are consequences to that. On NPR recently, there was a program on the value of eating bugs because nobody was eating, this was just wasted protein, and why should we eat cows when there are bugs to eat? Well, I don't understand why they didn't think about it, but the bugs weren't being wasted. I mean, I don't know that much about entomology, but I do know that when the bugs die, they go into the ground and something eats them, and then eventually I eat the larger animal. So that's an example of writing to your national. I listen to NPR, and I write in and I criticize and I complain about what they say that's not accurate. And I think that that is a very valuable way of approaching the schism of the fact that so much from the left is being misrepresented.
You have to know the enemy, and listening to NPR is a great way to get inside of their brains, I guess, so to speak. And I just recognize the social scores, like the Chinese use, of course, as ESG, environmental, social justice, and governance. This is what they're going to, the big corporations, the banks, et cetera, the big banks are trying to use this right now. And I think we all realize that. So it's called ESG. In my world, it's the same thing as what you've said.
Yep. Well, I have a couple of books in the hopper. One of them is called The Onion Conspiracy, and it describes the organizational structure of communism. And it was the idea was given to me by a Estonian defector whose father was a member of the Central Committee. And I mean, the guy, he got in trouble and he jumped on a fishing boat, and when it passed through the Øresund, which is the little narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden, he jumped in and swam to Denmark in the Baltic Sea in the spring when the temperature is in like the 40s. And the only reason he survived was because he was a national swimmer. He was a nationally renowned swimmer. But anyway, he described this, the Onion Conspiracy, and what it is. And it's the same way in the United States. You have a core of people who know what the real agenda is. And that core is a small group of people who will be the beneficiaries. Klaus Schwab, George Soros, Barack Obama. And of course, these are the public faces, and there's other people beneath them who are part of that core of the conspiracy. And they know that the whole thing is all about nothing more than absolute power and wealth for them to the expense of everyone else. They know that. And then they're surrounded by people who have some of the ideas, but they're what I call the true believers. And these are the people who are really the ones who push this because they give it legitimacy. There is no legitimacy to it. There is no good result from anything the communists want to bring. All they want is power and wealth, and they will do whatever they can to get it. But they have this well-trained cadre, what I call true believers, and Sergei Nechayev was a true believer. Willy Munzenberg was a true believer. Many of those people, they gave their lives literally for communism. And, Willy Munzenberg, I admire the guy for his brilliance and his organizational skill and his dedication. And of course, his payoff for that was to be murdered by Stalin. So, and then there is the media, all these groups that basically serve the core. And but ultimately, the goal is power and wealth, and people who may have been true believers when they were younger and they grow up in this thing, they realize that it's all just about making a lot of money and not having to do anything to get there. And, you know, to me, it's the battle that we've been fighting since the Garden of Eden, when Satan said, "Ye shall be as gods." The only thing that we can do ultimately to stop the left is enforce the law. The left needs to start paying for their treason, and maybe we need to beef up the subversion laws, or we need to enforce the laws. All the Antifa folks who were engaged in rioting last year should be in jail for 10 years. I mean, there's just no excuse for any of that stuff. But we need to elect tough people who are willing to enforce the law, because the left is only going to stop when either by being thrown in jail or at the point of a gun. That's the only time they're going to stop.
That'll do it for tonight, folks. Thanks everybody for being here. Hope to see you again next month. Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Take care.
Night.